A billionaire walked into his own company wearing a worn jacket and faded jeans. The receptionist took one look at him and said, "Delivery entrance is around back." She had no idea she was speaking to the man who signed her paycheck. The executives upstairs were celebrating their latest scheme, drinking champagne at 11 a.m., completely unaware that the silent investor they'd never met was about to walk through that door. What happened next would cost them everything. Because this wasn't just any billionaire. This was Keanu Reeves. And he hadn't come to talk, he'd come to take back what was his. But the conspiracy he discovered was far worse than disrespect. They weren't just arrogant, they were planning the biggest betrayal in corporate history. Most people know Keanu Reeves as an actor. What they don't know is that 7 years ago, he quietly co-founded Meridian Studios, an independent film company in the heart of Los Angeles. He owned 53% of the company, making him the majority shareholder and the single most powerful person in the building. But unlike most wealthy investors who demand constant attention and recognition, Keanu had chosen a different path. He remained completely anonymous. In every official document, he was listed simply as K. Reeves. No photographs in company materials, no name on the wall, no executive parking space with his name on it. Most of the 900 employees had never met him. Many didn't even know he existed. For 7 years, Keanu had stepped back from daily operations, dedicating his time to humanitarian work around the world, building homes in disaster zones, funding children's hospitals, supporting cancer research in memory of those he'd lost. He had trusted his executive team to maintain the values he had built into Meridian Studios from the very beginning. Respect for every person, dignity regardless of position, merit over appearance. He communicated through carefully worded emails and occasional video calls, always with his camera off, preferring to listen and observe rather than be seen and recognized. Perhaps that trust had been his mistake. On this particular Wednesday morning in October, Keanu made a decision he hadn't made in 7 years. He decided to visit the company headquarters without any warning, without any announcement, without giving anyone time to prepare or put on a performance. He wanted to see the real Meridian Studios, not the polished version that appeared in quarterly reports. He wanted to feel the actual culture, not read sanitized summaries written by people trying to impress him. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send an assistant to arrange meetings. He simply showed up the way any owner might drop in to check on something they genuinely cared about. The Meridian Studios building was an impressive structure of glass and steel rising 15 stories into the Los Angeles sky. The lobby was designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine, abstract sculptures that cost more than luxury cars, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with California sunlight. Everything about the entrance screamed wealth, power, and corporate success. It was meant to make visitors feel small and remind them they were entering a place where important people made important decisions. Keanu walked through those gleaming doors dressed exactly as he always was in his private life. A brown leather jacket that had been with him for over a decade, softened by wear and weather, bearing the marks of actual living rather than designer aging. Faded jeans that fit comfortably, chosen for function rather than fashion. Simple canvas sneakers that had walked thousands of miles. A dark gray beanie pulled low, partly because the morning had been cool, partly out of long habit. Over his shoulder hung a weathered leather satchel, the kind you might find in a vintage shop, unremarkable and modest in appearance. To anyone glancing his way, he looked like someone who might work at a bookstore, or teach music lessons on weekends, or repair motorcycles in a small garage. He certainly didn't look like a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He definitely didn't look like someone who owned the building he was walking into. And that, of course, was exactly the point. Keanu had learned long ago that how people treated you when they thought you were nobody revealed their true character. The receptionist sat behind a sleek modern desk that seemed to float in the center of the lobby. Her name tag read Jessica Chen, and she had joined Meridian Studios 8 months earlier, fresh from a prestigious communications program and eager to climb the entertainment industry ladder. She had been extensively trained in the art of gatekeeping, in distinguishing between people who mattered and people who didn't. In the entertainment industry, everyone who walked through those doors believed they were special. Actors with their desperate hope masked as casual confidence, directors with their artistic intensity and dramatic scarves, writers clutching scripts like winning lottery tickets, agents with their expensive suits and practiced smiles. Jessica's job was to sort the genuinely important from the merely hopeful, and she had developed what she believed was an excellent eye for the difference. She looked up as Keanu approached the desk. There was something familiar about his face, even partially hidden beneath that beanie. Those distinctive features, those kind eyes, that quiet way of moving through space as if he had no need to dominate it. Recognition flickered in her mind like a candle in the wind. Keanu Reeves, the actor. She had seen his movies years ago. Her older brother had been obsessed with those action films where Keanu moved through impossible situations with preternatural calm. But that was a different era, wasn't it? That was back when he was relevant. Her initial spark of interest faded quickly, replaced by professional assessment. She saw celebrities regularly. This was a film studio after all. Just 2 weeks ago, she had directed a famous director to the executive floor without so much as a flutter in her pulse. She was beyond being starstruck. Besides, she thought, studying him with the cool evaluation she had perfected over 8 months, when was the last time Keanu Reeves had been in anything significant? She couldn't recall seeing his name attached to any major project recently. No buzz on social media, no premieres covered by entertainment news, no mentions in the industry trades she monitored religiously. He had faded from the spotlight the way so many actors did once their moment passed, their star dimmed, their phone stopped ringing. Looking at his worn jacket, his old canvas bag, the beanie that seemed almost shabby in this temple of polished success, Jessica felt her assessment solidify into certainty. This was not a man at the height of his career. This was someone on the decline, probably here hoping to charm his way into a meeting, maybe angle for a small role in one of their upcoming productions. She had seen it before. Former stars who couldn't accept that their time had ended, wandering into studios with hopeful smiles and outdated headshots, trying to recapture magic that had long since evaporated. It was sad, really, but it wasn't her job to be sentimental. Her job was to protect the executive's time from people who didn't matter. She arranged her face into that particular expression of polite dismissal, the practiced smile that conveyed surface helpfulness while communicating clearly that the person before her was not particularly important, not particularly worth her time or attention. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone efficient and cool, already mentally moving on to the next task on her list. "I'm here to see the executive team," Keanu said quietly. His voice was soft, unhurried, carrying none of the demanding energy she usually heard from industry people trying to project importance or desperately signal their relevance. "Do you have an appointment?" Jessica asked, though she already knew the answer. She had access to all executive calendars. There was no appointment. "No, I don't," Keanu replied simply. Jessica almost laughed. Almost. No appointment. Dressed like that, expecting to walk in and see the executives? This was exactly the kind of optimistic delusion she encountered weekly. These people watched too many movies where persistence and charm won the day. They didn't understand how the real world worked. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice taking on that practiced tone of false sympathy perfected by receptionists and gatekeepers everywhere. "But the executive team is in a critical strategic planning session right now. They absolutely cannot be disturbed under any circumstances. These sessions are essential to the company's future direction." She paused,
letting the weight of those important-sounding words settle, reminding him of his place in the hierarchy of relevance. "You're welcome to wait over there," she continued, gesturing vaguely toward a row of simple chairs positioned along the wall near the service elevators. They were deliberately placed away from the main traffic flow, out of sight from the important areas, the kind of seating reserved for delivery people waiting for signatures, maintenance workers waiting for approval, and visitors who didn't quite belong. "But honestly," she added, lowering her voice as if sharing a helpful insider secret, "it could be a very long wait. These strategic sessions sometimes go on for hours. You might want to come back another time, or perhaps call ahead to schedule something proper through the appropriate channels." Keanu looked at her for a long moment, his expression completely unreadable. Then he simply nodded. "I'll wait," he said. He walked to the chair she had indicated and sat down, his old satchel resting on his lap. He didn't argue, he didn't protest, he didn't pull out a business card, or drop names, or demand to speak with someone in charge. He didn't make a scene, or invoke his past fame, or try to leverage his recognizable face. He simply accepted the seat he had been assigned, like a man who understood that some lessons could only be learned through careful observation. Jessica watched him go, then turned back to her computer with a small shake of her head. Just another hopeful soul who would eventually realize he was wasting his time and leave. She had already forgotten him before he even sat down. Minutes passed. The lobby hummed with the busy energy of a successful enterprise operating at full capacity. Well-dressed men and women strode past in purposeful strides, their expensive shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished marble floor like a percussion section of corporate success. They carried tablets and phones and MacBooks and the unmistakable air of people who believed their work truly mattered, that they were participants in something meaningful and important. None of them glanced at the man in the worn jacket sitting quietly by the wall. He was furniture. He was background. He was nobody. A group of young executives hurried past, discussing market projections in loud, confident voices, throwing around terms like vertical integration and synergistic partnerships. They didn't notice him. A woman in designer heels click-clacked by, speaking rapidly into her phone about a talent negotiation, her voice carrying across the lobby with the casual assumption that everyone should hear how important her conversation was. She didn't see him. An older gentleman in a perfectly tailored suit strode toward the elevator, checking his Rolex with the practiced gesture of someone who wanted everyone to notice he was checking his Rolex. He didn't acknowledge the quiet figure in the waiting area. Keanu watched them all. He noted the expensive watches that cost more than cars, the designer bags that cost more than rent, the carefully cultivated images of success and power and importance. He remembered when Meridian Studios had been different, when he had walked these halls himself in the early days, talking to everyone from the creative directors to the cleaning staff, learning names, hearing stories, building a culture where ideas mattered more than appearances, where every person was treated with dignity regardless of their title or their wardrobe or their position in the hierarchy. What he was seeing now was something else entirely, something he hadn't built, something he wouldn't have approved, something that would need to be corrected. About 8 minutes into his wait, a young man emerged from a side corridor, moving with the swagger of someone who believed the universe was arranging itself for his inevitable success. His name was Tyler Ashford, and he had recently been promoted to Junior Vice President of Development. It was a modest title in the grand hierarchy, but Tyler wore it like a crown bestowed by royalty. His suit was expensive and slightly too tight, chosen for its Italian label and impressive price tag rather than its fit. On his wrist gleamed a gold Rolex that had cost him 4 months of salary, a purchase he considered an essential investment in his professional image, in signaling to others that he was someone who mattered. Tyler walked with the confident stride of someone who had never known real failure, never experienced genuine hardship, never learned that the universe doesn't actually care about your self-perception. He was heading to the executive lounge when he noticed the man sitting in the waiting area. He recognized the face immediately, even with the beanie and the fuller beard. Keanu Reeves, the action star from those old movies that played on cable television late at night. The guy from The Matrix, which was, 25 years ago? Ancient history in Hollywood terms. But instead of respect or even basic curiosity, Tyler felt a warm surge of superiority flood through him. He had heard the whispers in industry circles, the knowing comments at networking events. Keanu Reeves had gone quiet. No major projects in years. No presence at the important parties. No mentions in the trades. No representation at the agencies that mattered. He was yesterday's headline, a name that belonged to a different chapter of Hollywood history, filed away in the archives of Remember When. And just look at how he was dressed. Tyler's eyes swept over the worn leather jacket that had seen better days, the faded jeans that probably came from a discount store, the old canvas bag that looked like it had been purchased at a thrift shop, the beanie that was frankly embarrassing. This was not how successful people presented themselves. This was not how people who mattered dressed when they came to a major studio.
This was how people looked when they had given up, when they were desperate, when they had nothing left but hope and a familiar face from better days. Tyler smirked to himself, feeling that pleasant sense of superiority that comes from comparing yourself favorably to someone who used to be more successful than you. This was probably some washed-up celebrity hoping to leverage past fame into a present opportunity. Maybe he was here to audition for a supporting role, or worse, to beg for any part at all, any chance to be relevant again, to feel the spotlight one more time before it moved on permanently. How the mighty had fallen. In this business, Tyler knew with absolute certainty, you were only as good as your last success. And Keanu Reeves hadn't had a success in a very, very long time. He walked past without acknowledgement, not a nod, not a polite smile, not even the basic courtesy one stranger might extend to another in an elevator or a coffee shop. He simply continued to the water cooler, filled his cup with elaborate slowness, and walked back the same way, his eyes fixed on his phone, deliberately not looking at the waiting visitor, making his dismissal clear and intentional. Why would he acknowledge someone like that? People who looked like that, people who were clearly past their prime, did not deserve his attention. His attention was valuable. His time was precious. He had important places to be. Keanu watched him pass. He noted the expensive watch worn like a badge of honor, the self-satisfied stride of unearned confidence, the casual arrogance in every movement, every gesture, every deliberately averted glance. He said nothing. His face revealed nothing. But behind those calm, observant eyes, something was being carefully recorded, filed away, understood with perfect clarity. From his seat in the hallway, Keanu had a clear view through the glass walls of the main conference room. The architecture of the building had been designed for transparency, for openness, for the modern illusion that everything was visible and nothing was hidden. But what Keanu saw through that transparent glass was anything but transparent, or open, or honest. Inside sat the men who were supposedly running his company, supposedly upholding his values, supposedly maintaining the culture he had so carefully built. Harrison Vance, the chief operating officer, was leaning back in his leather chair with the casual ease of a king surveying his domain from an unquestionable throne. He was in his early 50s, silver hair perfectly styled by hands that charged $300 for a cut, suit impeccably tailored by craftsmen who measured 17 different points on the body to ensure perfection. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. He was gesturing broadly as he spoke, his hands cutting through the air in expansive movements, designed as much to show off that expensive timepiece as to emphasize whatever points he was making.
Next to him sat Preston Calloway, the chief financial officer, younger than Harrison by perhaps a decade, but equally polished, equally entitled, equally comfortable in his assumption of permanent power. He was nodding along to whatever Harrison was saying, occasionally adding comments that made both men laugh with the comfortable ease of inside jokes, of shared secrets, of men who believed they were untouchable. On the table before Preston sat a crystal glass of champagne, bubbles rising lazily through amber liquid. It was barely 11 a.m., but apparently the rules about drinking during business hours didn't apply to men at this level of importance. Harrison Vance, the chief financial officer, was leaning back in his leather chair with the casual ease of a king surveying his domain from an unquestionable throne. He was in his early 50s, silver hair perfectly styled by hands that charged $300 for a cut, suit impeccably tailored by craftsmen who measured 17 different points on the body to ensure perfection. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. He was gesturing broadly as he spoke, his hands cutting through the air in expansive movements designed as much to show off that expensive timepiece as to emphasize whatever points he was making. Next to him sat Preston Calloway, the chief financial officer, younger than Harrison by perhaps a decade, but equally polished, equally entitled, equally comfortable in his assumption of permanent power. He was nodding along to whatever Harrison was saying, occasionally adding comments that made both men laugh with the comfortable ease of inside jokes, of shared secrets, of men who believed they were untouchable. On the table before Preston sat a crystal glass of champagne, bubbles rising lazily through amber liquid. It was barely 11 a.m., but apparently the rules about drinking during business hours didn't apply to men at this level of importance. Harrison Vance, the chief operating officer, was gesturing broadly as he spoke, his hands cutting through the air in expansive movements, designed as much to show off that expensive timepiece as to emphasize whatever points he was making. Next to him sat Preston Calloway, the chief financial officer, younger than Harrison by perhaps a decade, but equally polished, equally entitled, equally comfortable in his assumption of permanent power. He was nodding along to whatever Harrison was saying, occasionally adding comments that made both men laugh with the comfortable ease of inside jokes, of shared secrets, of men who believed they were untouchable. On the table before Preston sat a crystal glass of champagne, bubbles rising lazily through amber liquid. It was barely 11 a.m., but apparently the rules about drinking during business hours didn't apply to men at this level of importance. Harrison Vance, the chief operating officer, was leaning back in his leather chair with the casual ease of a king surveying his domain from an unquestionable throne. He was in his early 50s, silver hair perfectly styled by hands that charged $300 for a cut, suit impeccably tailored by craftsmen who measured 17 different points on the body to ensure perfection. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. He was gesturing broadly as he spoke, his hands cutting through the air in expansive movements designed as much to show off that expensive timepiece as to emphasize whatever points he was making. Next to him sat Preston Calloway, the chief financial officer, younger than Harrison by perhaps a decade, but equally polished, equally entitled, equally comfortable in his assumption of permanent power. He was nodding along to whatever Harrison was saying, occasionally adding comments that made both men laugh with the comfortable ease of inside jokes, of shared secrets, of men who believed they were untouchable. On the table before Preston sat a crystal glass of champagne, bubbles rising lazily through amber liquid. It was barely 11 a.m., but apparently the rules about drinking during business hours didn't apply to men at this level of importance.
Near the coffee station hovered a third figure, Mitchell Crawford, the chief of staff, whose primary function seemed to be agreeing enthusiastically with everything Harrison and Preston said. He laughed at their jokes half a beat too late, the timing always slightly off. He nodded with excessive energy, like a bobblehead doll in the back window of a car. He refilled their cups with the attentiveness of a servant rather than a colleague.
The perfect portrait of a man who had learned that advancement came from flattery rather than competence, from agreement rather than insight. The official calendar labeled this gathering a strategic planning session and executive alignment meeting. The invitation probably used important corporate words like synergy and optimization and forward momentum and stakeholder value. But Keanu could see the truth through that glass wall, could read the reality of what was actually happening. This was not strategy. This was not planning. This was not alignment. This was three men enjoying the comfortable fruits of positions they had not earned, insulated in a bubble of privilege and power they had built around themselves with his money, his company, his trust. Keanu remembered when he had promoted Harrison Vance 5 years ago, when Meridian was still finding its footing in a competitive industry. He had seen ambition in Harrison's eyes and mistaken it for dedication. He had seen hunger and assumed it was passion for the work itself, for the mission, for the values. He had trusted him to be a steward of something meaningful, never imagining Harrison would transform himself into a king, would build a kingdom, would forget entirely what Meridian was supposed to represent. The company Keanu had founded on principles of respect, hard work, integrity, and treating every person with dignity had been hollowed out from the inside like a tree that looks solid until you realize the core has rotted away. The executives had created a culture in their own image, a world where status was measured by the cost of your watch, where worth was determined by the brand of your suit, where someone in a worn jacket and old sneakers was automatically categorized as beneath notice, beneath respect, beneath basic human courtesy. They had built exactly the kind of environment Keanu had always despised, had spent his entire life trying to avoid, had specifically designed Meridian Studios to reject. 10 minutes had now passed since Keanu had sat down in that uncomfortable chair. 10 minutes of being ignored, dismissed, forgotten. 10 minutes while he watched his company operate under a philosophy that was the complete opposite of everything he believed in, everything he had tried to build. No one had come to check on him. No one had offered him a glass of water or a cup of coffee. No one had apologized for the delay or provided an update on when someone might be available. He had been categorized as unimportant and promptly forgotten, left to sit in his uncomfortable chair like an inconvenience that would eventually tire itself out and leave on its own. For most of those 10 minutes, Keanu had remained completely still, watching and processing and understanding. He was not a man given to quick anger or impulsive decisions or emotional reactions. Life had taught him patience. Loss had taught him perspective. He had learned long ago that wisdom came from observing carefully before acting, from understanding fully before judging, from seeing the complete picture before making moves that couldn't be undone. But patience was not the same as acceptance. Understanding a problem did not mean tolerating it. Seeing clearly did not mean doing nothing. He had seen enough. He understood enough. He had decided what needed to happen next.
Keanu stood up from the uncomfortable waiting chair. The movement was slow and deliberate, carrying none of the hesitation of someone unsure of their position or their right to be there. His old satchel shifted to his shoulder with practiced ease. His eyes, which had been soft and patient moments before, now held something different. Not anger exactly, not rage, but a cold, crystalline clarity. The look of a man who had made a calculation, reached a conclusion, and was ready to execute it with absolute certainty. He didn't smooth his jacket or adjust his beanie or try to make himself look more presentable or impressive for what was about to happen. He was not trying to meet their standards or their expectations or their judgments. He was simply preparing to walk into a room and change everything. Without a word to Jessica, the receptionist who had dismissed him, without seeking permission from anyone, without announcement or hesitation, Keanu began walking toward the glass-walled conference room. His footsteps were steady and measured on the polished marble floor, each one landing with quiet certainty.
Not fast, not aggressive, not rushed, simply inevitable. Each step brought him closer to the men who had built their comfortable lives on the foundation he had created, who had transformed his vision into their personal kingdom, who had taken his trust and turned it into their entitlement. The men who had no idea that the person they had dismissed as irrelevant was about to become the most important figure in their professional lives. The man in the worn leather jacket and old beanie, carrying nothing but a modest satchel and 7 years of patient observation, was about to remind them of a fundamental truth they had forgotten. He was about to teach them that ownership isn't about appearances, power isn't about performances, and respect should never have been conditional in the first place. Keanu didn't knock. There was no tentative rap on the door, no polite announcement of his presence. He simply placed his hand on the heavy oak door of the executive conference room and pushed it wide open with smooth, unhurried authority. The movement carried the quiet confidence of someone who had every right to be exactly where he was, who needed no permission, no invitation, no approval. The sound of laughter died instantly, cut off as cleanly as if someone had pressed a mute button. Harrison Vance had been leaning back in his leather chair, mouth open mid-sentence, one hand frozen in an expansive gesture. Now he sat motionless, his expression shifting rapidly from amusement to confusion to the first flickers of anger. Who was this person interrupting their private meeting? Preston Calloway had snapped his head around at the sound of the door, his eyes going wide with surprise and growing irritation. His hand was still wrapped around his crystal champagne glass, forgotten entirely in his shock. Mitchell Crawford, who had been hovering near the coffee station, startled so violently that he sent a stream of hot coffee spilling across the expensive carpet. He stared at the spreading brown stain for a moment, then at the intruder, his face a portrait of bewildered panic. What was happening? Who was this? How had security allowed this? Harrison recovered first, his initial confusion hardening into outrage as he took in the full appearance of the man who had just walked uninvited into their private executive session. The worn leather jacket that had clearly seen better days, the faded jeans that belonged in a laundromat commercial, the dark beanie that looked like something a homeless person might wear, the old canvas satchel that probably contained nothing of value. Everything about this person screamed that he did not belong here, that he was in the wrong place, that this was a violation of the natural order. Harrison rose from his chair with the deliberate slowness of a man reasserting his authority. His face was reddening with indignation. "Who the hell are you?" Harrison demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl designed to intimidate. "This is a private executive session. Security is supposed to vet every single outsider who enters this building." He turned to Mitchell, his anger finding a target. "Crawford, who is this man? How did he get in here? Why wasn't I informed?" Mitchell could only stammer, his face pale. I don't know, sir. I'll call security immediately, right now." His hands fumbled for his phone. Preston had risen from his seat as well, studying the intruder with narrowed eyes and growing recognition. Unlike Harrison, something about that face was triggering a memory, a connection. "Wait," Preston said, holding up a hand to stop Mitchell's frantic phone search. "I know who this is." He stepped closer, looking Keanu up and down with undisguised disdain, his lip curling slightly in an expression of contempt. "Keanu Reeves," he said, a small, cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The actor, or should I say, the former actor." He emphasized the word former with particular relish. "If you're here looking for work, Mr. Reeves, this really isn't how it's done in the professional world. We're not producing anything that would suit someone of your vintage. Your particular demographic moment has passed." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked at Keanu again, reassessing with this new information. Yes, he could see it now. The face was familiar, though aged and partially hidden. Keanu Reeves, someone who had been famous once, before the world moved on to newer, younger, more relevant stars. But recognition brought no respect, no courtesy, no change in attitude. What was a washed-up actor doing here, interrupting their important meeting? "I suggest you leave now," Harrison said, his voice hard and final, settling back into his chair as if the matter was concluded. "Crawford, call security and have him escorted out immediately. Make sure they understand this is a failure of their protocols." Through all of this, Keanu had not said a single word. He stood just inside the doorway, perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. He didn't defend himself against their insults. He didn't argue or explain or justify his presence. He didn't try to convince them of anything. Instead, his eyes were fixed on something at the far end of the conference table. The chair at the head of the table. His chair. The one he had personally designed 7 years ago when Meridian Studios was just a dream being carefully built into reality. Without acknowledging the executives or their threats or their growing agitation, Keanu began to walk. His footsteps were measured and deliberate, each one landing with soft, certain purpose. He moved past the startled faces of men who could not understand what was happening, who couldn't process why this person wasn't listening to their commands, heading directly and inevitably toward that chair at the head of the table. "What do you think you're doing?" Harrison sputtered, rising again, his face now fully crimson. "Crawford, I said call security, now!" Preston commanded, stepping forward to physically block Keanu's path. "Stop right there. You need to leave immediately before we have you arrested for trespassing. This is private property. You're breaking multiple laws right now." Keanu stopped walking. He was perhaps 10 feet from the head of the table, standing calmly while 3 increasingly agitated executives surrounded him like predators circling prey. Slowly, deliberately, with the careful attention of someone performing a ritual, Keanu reached up and removed the dark beanie from his head. With the hat gone, his face was fully visible for the first time, no longer partially hidden. The familiar features that had appeared on movie screens around the world. The thoughtful eyes that had always seemed to see more than they revealed. The quiet strength that had nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with certainty of purpose. He folded the beanie with precise movements and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he reached into his worn leather jacket and withdrew a card. It was an identification badge bearing a photograph, a name in clear letters, and a series of codes and numbers that meant everything to anyone who understood corporate governance and ownership structures. Keanu placed the card on the polished conference table with a soft click and slid it gently toward Harrison Vance. The room went completely silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Harrison looked down at the card as if it might be a snake. His hand reached out slowly, reluctantly, and picked it up. His eyes scanned the information. The photograph. The name, K. Reeves. The designation, majority shareholder. The ownership percentage, 53%. The authorization level, unlimited. The color drained from Harrison's face like water from a broken glass. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand began to shake, the card trembling between his fingers. Preston snatched the card from Harrison's trembling hand, his own confidence beginning to crack. He stared at it, reading the information once, twice, 3 times, as if repeated reading might change what it said. "K. Reeves," Preston muttered, his voice hollow and distant. "The majority shareholder we've only communicated with through email for 7 years? The silent investor? The anonymous owner? That's you?" Keanu didn't answer. He didn't need to. The card said everything that needed to be said. He simply walked the remaining distance to the head of the table, each step echoing in the absolute silence, and lowered himself into the chair that had been designed for him 7 years ago. The leather creaked softly as he settled into place, a sound that echoed through the silent room like a gavel falling in a courtroom, declaring that judgment was about to be rendered. He had reclaimed his seat. He had reclaimed his position. He had reclaimed his company. The 3 executives stood frozen, their faces portraits of dawning horror, of professional lives flashing before their eyes, of kingdoms crumbling in real time. Harrison looked like a man watching his entire world collapse foundation by foundation. Preston's arrogance had crumbled into something that resembled genuine fear. Mitchell had forgotten about his phone entirely, forgotten about calling security, forgotten about everything except the terrible reality settling over the room like a suffocating blanket. Then Keanu spoke. His voice was not loud. He didn't shout or rage or let emotion color his words. He simply spoke in a calm, measured tone that somehow carried more weight than any amount of screaming ever could. 10 minutes, he said. I sat in that hallway for 10 minutes. He paused, letting them fully absorb what he was saying. I am the co-founder of this company, the majority shareholder. I control 53% of Meridian Studios. And because I walked in wearing an old jacket instead of a designer suit, I was treated like garbage.
Told to wait in a hallway like a delivery man hoping for someone to sign for his package. Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate and nothing like his usual authoritative tone. Mr. Reeves, this is a terrible misunderstanding, a complete failure of communication. We had absolutely no idea. If we had known, please, we can explain everything. This can be fixed.
No, Keanu said, and though his voice remained soft, that single word cut through Harrison's stammering like a blade through paper. There is nothing to explain, nothing to fix, nothing to misunderstand. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting flat on the polished table surface. This was not a failure of your receptionist. She was following the culture you created. She treated me exactly how she's been trained to treat people who don't look wealthy enough to matter. That young executive who walked past me in the hallway, who looked right at me and decided I wasn't worth even basic acknowledgement, he learned that attitude from you. He learned it from the culture you've built here. Keanu's gaze moved deliberately across their faces, holding each man's eyes in turn. You have built a culture in my company where human beings are judged by the price of their clothing, where respect is determined by the brand of watch on someone's wrist, where a person in a worn jacket is automatically assumed to be worthless, to be nobody, to be beneath the basic courtesy that should be extended to every human being. Preston attempted to regain some composure, straightening his shoulders. With all due respect, you've been absent for 7 years. We've managed the daily operations. We've grown the revenue by 40%. We've expanded into new markets. A misunderstanding at reception doesn't negate years of successful leadership. Keanu regarded him with an expression that was almost sad, as if he were looking at someone who had just failed a test they didn't even know they were taking. Leadership, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. Sitting in this room drinking champagne before noon while your employees work? Building a culture where people are afraid to speak up? Creating an environment where the quality of someone's shoes matters more than the quality of their ideas? Where arrogance is mistaken for confidence and entitlement is mistaken for authority? He shook his head slowly. That is not leadership, Mr. Calloway. That is not management. That is entitlement. That is privilege without responsibility. That is exactly what I designed this company to stand against. Harrison made one last desperate attempt, his voice pleading now, all pretense of authority stripped away. Keanu,
Please, we can change protocols immediately, retrain all staff, implement new cultural standards. There's no need for anything drastic. We can fix this. Give us a chance to make it right." Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice carried absolute finality, the sound of a door closing that would never open again. "You had 7 years to maintain the culture of respect I built into this company from the very beginning. Instead, you built a kingdom for yourselves and forgot that every person who walks through those doors deserves basic human dignity. You forgot the fundamental principle that worth is not measured by wealth, that respect should not be conditional." His eyes locked onto Harrison's with laser focus. "And that is why you no longer work here." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You no longer work here." 5 simple words, 5 single-syllable words, but they changed everything. For a moment, no one moved.
The executives stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what had just happened, unable to fully accept the reality that had just been declared. One moment they had been laughing, drinking champagne, enjoying their comfortable positions of power and privilege. The next moment, a man in a worn leather jacket had walked in and dismantled their entire world with 5 simple words. Harrison Vance was the first to break the frozen tableau. "This is insane," he shouted, slamming his palm on the conference table with enough force to rattle the crystal glasses and send champagne sloshing. "You cannot fire us because of a misunderstanding at reception. This is completely unreasonable. We have contracts, we have rights, we have lawyers who will tear you apart in court. You'll be facing wrongful termination lawsuits before the end of the day." His face had gone from pale shock back to crimson rage. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but anger was easier to access, easier to perform. Anger felt like power, even when all power had been stripped away. Anger was the last refuge of men who had nothing left. Preston Calloway found his voice as well, though it came out higher and tighter than his usual smooth, controlled tone. "You've been absent for 7 years," Preston spat, jabbing a finger toward Keanu like an accusation. 7 years! We're the ones who kept this company running. We managed the operations. We grew the revenue. We maintained the industry relationships. We made the decisions that mattered. You can't just waltz in here and destroy everything because someone asked you to wait a few minutes in a lobby." Mitchell Crawford said nothing. He had collapsed into one of the side chairs, his face the color of old paper, his coffee-stained hands trembling in his lap. His entire body language speaking of a man who knew his world had just ended and there was nothing he could say or do to change it. Keanu listened to their outbursts without expression, without reaction. He let them rage, let them threaten, let them convince themselves that volume and indignation might somehow reverse what was happening, might somehow undo what had been decided. When they finally ran out of breath, their voices hoarse from shouting, Keanu reached for the old leather satchel that had been sitting on his shoulder throughout this entire confrontation. He placed it on the table with a soft thud and opened it with the calm deliberation of a surgeon preparing instruments for a necessary operation. From inside, he withdrew a thin folder with a black cover, simple, unremarkable, the kind of folder that might contain anything or nothing. But this particular folder contained everything. Keanu placed it on the polished surface and opened it to the first page. Clause 8.2, he read, his voice clear and measured. Shareholder agreement dated March 15, 2019. He paused, letting the date sink in, letting them understand that this was not some improvised response, not some emotional reaction. This was a document that had been in place for years, waiting for exactly this moment. The majority shareholder, holding over 50% of company shares, retains the right to immediate termination of any executive officer upon material evidence of gross negligence,
ethical violations, or systemic failure to maintain the operational integrity and foundational values of the company. Keanu looked up from the document, his eyes moving deliberately across the three men who stood before him in various states of distress.
Your collective failure to recognize the individual who controls this company, combined with your decision to treat that individual with contempt based solely on his appearance, constitutes material evidence of catastrophic failure in judgment at the highest leadership level. It demonstrates a complete abandonment of the values this company was founded on. Harrison's face contorted with desperate calculation. That's not material evidence. That's your bruised ego looking for legal cover. No court would uphold termination based on that. I wasn't finished, Keanu said quietly, and something in his tone made Harrison's mouth snap shut. Keanu turned to the next page in the folder, his movements unhurried. In addition to today's events, I have documentation here regarding the transfer of $6.2 million from the Film Development Fund into an account labeled Special Executive Discretionary Operations. Over the past 14 months, this account has been used for purposes that have nothing whatsoever to do with company operations or legitimate business expenses. He looked directly at Preston Calloway, holding his gaze. Private jet rentals to vacation destinations, luxury resort stays with no business purpose, personal vehicle purchases, country club memberships, a yacht rental in the Mediterranean, all billed to a fund that was supposed to be developing new film projects, supporting emerging talent, and investing in the company's creative future. Preston's face went gray, all blood seeming to drain from his features. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged. This, Keanu continued, his voice hardening slightly, constitutes evidence of breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of company funds, and financial fraud. According to the clause I just read, any one of these violations gives me the right to terminate your employment immediately. No advance notice required, no board vote necessary, no process beyond my decision as majority shareholder. He closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the silent room like a judge's gavel falling. Harrison Vance, Preston Calloway, Mitchell Crawford, and all executives who report directly to you. Your employment with Meridian Studios is terminated, effective immediately. The room seemed to lose all its oxygen. Harrison's rage had deflated into something that looked remarkably like terror. Preston was gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, keeping him from collapsing entirely. Mitchell had not moved at all, had not reacted, seemed to have retreated somewhere inside himself where the terrible reality couldn't quite reach him yet. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. He pressed a single button, speed dial. "Vivian," he said calmly into the phone, his voice betraying no emotion. "I need you and your team at the executive boardroom immediately. We have terminations to process." Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy oak door opened. Vivian Hartley entered first. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a precise bun and eyes that missed absolutely nothing, that saw through pretense and performance and got straight to the truth of things. She was Keanu's personal attorney, and she had built a formidable reputation in legal circles for being as efficient as she was ruthless, as precise as she was uncompromising. Behind her came 4 security personnel in dark uniforms, their expressions neutral and professional. Vivian surveyed the scene with a single glance, taking in the shell-shocked executives and the calm figure seated at the head of the table. Her expression revealed no surprise. She had been prepared for this possibility. "This," Keanu continued, his voice hardening slightly, "constitutes evidence of breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of company funds, and financial fraud. According to the clause I just read, any one of these violations gives me the right to terminate your employment immediately. No advance notice required, no board vote necessary, no process beyond my decision as majority shareholder. He closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the silent room like a judge's gavel falling. Harrison Vance, Preston Calloway, Mitchell Crawford, and all executives who report directly to you. Your employment with Meridian Studios is terminated, effective immediately. The room seemed to lose all its oxygen. Harrison's rage had deflated into something that looked remarkably like terror. Preston was gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, keeping him from collapsing entirely. Mitchell had not moved at all, had not reacted, seemed to have retreated somewhere inside himself where the terrible reality couldn't quite reach him yet. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. He pressed a single button, speed dial. "Vivian," he said calmly into the phone, his voice betraying no emotion. "I need you and your team at the executive boardroom immediately. We have terminations to process." Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy oak door opened. Vivian Hartley entered first. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a precise bun and eyes that missed absolutely nothing, that saw through pretense and performance and got straight to the truth of things. She was Keanu's personal attorney, and she had built a formidable reputation in legal circles for being as efficient as she was ruthless, as precise as she was uncompromising. Behind her came 4 security personnel in dark uniforms, their expressions neutral and professional. Vivian surveyed the scene with a single glance, taking in the shell-shocked executives and the calm figure seated at the head of the table. Her expression revealed no surprise. She had been prepared for this possibility.
She had been prepared for months. Collect all electronic devices, access cards, and company property, Keanu instructed without looking at the terminated executives. Their security clearances have already been revoked. Their email accounts are locked. Their access to all systems has been terminated. Escort them to their vehicles and ensure they take nothing that belongs to Meridian Studios. Harrison made one last desperate attempt, his voice rising to a shout. "You'll regret this, Reeves. You have no idea how to run this company on a day-to-day basis. Without us, Meridian will collapse within a month. We are the ones who know how everything works. We are the institutional knowledge. You're destroying everything we built." Keanu turned to face him, his expression holding no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph. Nothing but a cold disappointment that was somehow worse than rage, more cutting than any insult. "This company existed before you," Keanu said quietly. "It will exist long after you're gone. The only difference is that it will no longer be run by people who judge human worth by the price of a watch. It will no longer be a place where respect is conditional on appearance. It will return to what it was always meant to be." Harrison opened his mouth to respond, to argue, to make one more desperate attempt to change the trajectory of this disaster. But the security guards had already taken hold of his arms with firm, professional grips. Whatever he wanted to say died in his throat as he was guided firmly but inexorably toward the door. Preston followed without resistance, his earlier bravado completely shattered, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mitchell Crawford had to be helped to his feet, his legs apparently unwilling or unable to support him, his entire body language speaking of a man in shock. They were led out of the boardroom, down the polished marble hallway, past the curious stares of employees who had stopped their work to watch this unprecedented spectacle, past the receptionist's desk where this entire sequence of events had begun. Jessica watched them go with wide eyes, understanding flooding her face as she made the connection between the man she had dismissed and the executives now being escorted from the building by security. The laughter and champagne and comfortable arrogance that had filled this room just 20 minutes ago had been replaced by the heavy shuffle of feet walking toward the end of their careers, toward an uncertain future, toward the consequences of choices they had made over years without ever imagining they would have to pay for them. Keanu remained standing at the head of the conference table, his hands resting lightly on the back of the leather chair, watching the now empty doorway. The expensive cologne that Harrison favored still lingered in the air, mixing with the smell of spilled coffee and champagne. The crystal glasses still sat where they had been hastily abandoned, amber liquid catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Vivian was already on her phone, coordinating with surgical precision the systematic lockdown of all accounts and systems associated with the terminated executives, handling the destruction of 3 careers with the same efficiency she might use to order lunch or schedule a meeting. The door opened again, softly this time, tentatively. Keanu turned, expecting perhaps another security guard with a procedural question. Instead, he saw a man he did not immediately recognize. He was middle-aged, maybe 45, dressed simply in a button-down shirt and khaki pants. No expensive suit, no designer accessories, no Rolex. In his hands, he clutched a tablet computer like a shield, like evidence, like something precious and important. His expression was nervous but determined, the look of someone who had made a difficult decision and was committed to seeing it through despite his fear. "Mr. Reeves?" the man asked, his voice quiet but steady, carefully controlled. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm the Director of Technology and Security Infrastructure for Meridian Studios." Keanu studied him for a moment, searching his memory. The name was familiar. He remembered it from the quarterly technical reports he had reviewed over the years, detailed documents about system infrastructure and data security and digital architecture. Marcus Thorne had been with the company for 9 years. He had built most of the digital systems from scratch. He was known for being thorough, competent, and invisible. "I need to speak with you," Marcus continued, his words coming faster now, driven by urgency. "Before the news spreads throughout the building, before they have a chance to cover their tracks or destroy evidence, before it's too late." Keanu nodded slowly, gesturing for him to continue. "I'm listening." Marcus stepped further into the room, glancing at Vivian as if unsure whether to continue with her present. Keanu gave a small nod of reassurance. Whatever Marcus needed to say, Vivian could hear it. "What you did today, firing Harrison and Preston," Marcus began, his voice gaining strength. "You made the right decision, but you don't know how right you were. You don't know what they were really planning. You don't know how close we came to complete disaster." He opened his tablet and began scrolling through files with practiced efficiency. "6 months ago, I discovered irregularities in our network systems. Encrypted files being sent to external servers, video conferences with participants I didn't recognize, held on secured channels that deliberately bypassed normal company oversight, financial data being accessed at unusual hours, patterns that didn't make sense." Marcus looked up, meeting Keanu's eyes directly. Harrison and Preston were in secret negotiations with Titan Entertainment Group. They were planning to sell Meridian Studios, or more accurately, to strip it and sell the pieces. Keanu's expression didn't change dramatically, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, his focus sharpening. "Sell the company?" "Not exactly sell," Marcus said, his voice hardening with controlled anger. "Worse, much worse. They were planning to transfer the most valuable assets, the film library, the screenplay rights we own, the international distribution contracts, the intellectual property, into a new subsidiary that would be controlled by Titan Entertainment. Everything that makes Meridian valuable, everything we've built over 7 years, would be moved out, stripped away. And the rest?" Keanu asked, though he already sensed the answer, could already see where this was going. "The rest would be left to die," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "The studio facilities, the production equipment, the ongoing projects that weren't deemed profitable enough. and most importantly, the employees. More than 900 people work here, Mr. Reeves. 900 families who depend on Meridian for their livelihoods, for their health insurance, for their ability to pay rent and mortgages and put food on the table. He paused, steadying himself, his hands gripping the tablet so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Under Harrison's plan, the hollowed-out shell of Meridian would declare bankruptcy within 18 months. All those people would lose their jobs. 900 families destroyed. And Harrison and Preston? Marcus's voice filled with barely contained rage. They had already negotiated their exit packages, millions of dollars in severance payments, senior advisory positions at Titan with guaranteed salaries, stock options in the new entity. They were going to gut the company you built, destroy the lives of everyone who works here, and walk away rich, richer than they already were. The room fell into heavy silence. Keanu sat motionless, processing what he had just heard. His hand slowly closed into a fist on the table surface, the only outward sign of the anger building inside him. "Why didn't you report this through official channels?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge beneath it now, sharp and dangerous. Marcus lowered his head, shame washing over his features. "I tried, Mr. Reeves. 5 months ago, I submitted a detailed report to Harrison through internal audit channels. I documented everything I had found. I thought he would want to know. I thought there might be an innocent explanation. I thought I was helping." He laughed bitterly, a sound empty of humor. 2 days later, Harrison called me into his office. He looked at me with this cold expression and said, "If you continue involving yourself in matters above your pay grade, if you continue asking questions that aren't your concern, you'll be the first one let go when we restructure. And I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I'll make sure your name is poison." He made it very clear what would happen to my career, my reputation, my future if I didn't drop it immediately. Marcus's voice grew quieter. "I have 2 children, Mr. Reeves. A mortgage, a wife who works part-time so she can be home when the kids get out of school. I couldn't afford to lose this job. I couldn't risk my family's security. I couldn't take the chance that Harrison was bluffing." He straightened up, lifting his head, meeting Keanu's eyes again with determination. "But I also couldn't watch them destroy everything. I couldn't be complicit in ruining 900 lives. So I kept quiet publicly, played along, acted like I had dropped it. But privately, I documented everything, every transaction, every secret meeting, every piece of evidence I could find. I stored it all encrypted and hidden in systems they didn't know existed, waiting for a chance to use it, waiting for today." "You didn't know today would happen," Keanu said softly. Marcus shook his head. "No, I didn't know. But when I heard the commotion, when I saw them being escorted out by security, when I realized something had finally happened, I knew this might be my only opportunity, my only chance to speak up without losing everything. I had to take it." Keanu rose from his chair and walked slowly around the table toward Marcus. The younger man tensed slightly, uncertain what to expect, whether he had done the right thing, whether he was about to be punished for his silence, or rewarded for eventually speaking. Keanu stopped in front of him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saved this company," Keanu said quietly, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "Not me. I fired them because they disrespected someone they thought was unimportant. That was arrogance and cultural failure. But you're the one who discovered they were planning to destroy everything. You're the one who documented the evidence. You're the one who risked your career, your family's security to protect 900 people who will never know what you did for them." He paused, letting the words settle, letting Marcus understand that he was not in trouble, that he had done the right thing despite the impossible position he had been placed in. That's integrity, Marcus. That's real courage. That's the kind of character that those men in their expensive suits will never understand, because they've never had to make a choice between their principles and their security.
They've never had to risk anything real. Marcus blinked rapidly, his eyes suddenly bright with emotion he was struggling to contain. Keanu turned to Vivian, who had been listening to the entire exchange with her characteristic focused intensity. Add corporate conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud to the file, he instructed. I want a complete forensic audit of every transaction connected to Harrison and Preston. Everything they touched for the past 3 years. Every decision, every contract, every financial movement. If there's more, I want to find it. He looked back at Marcus. And effective immediately, Marcus Thorne is the acting chief technology officer of Meridian Studios. Marcus stared at him, stunned into complete silence, unable to process what he had just heard. I don't know what to say, Mr. Reeves. Don't say anything, Keanu replied. Go secure our systems. Make absolutely sure Harrison and Preston can't access anything remotely, can't delete anything, can't sabotage anything on their way out, can't cover their tracks or destroy evidence. Protect everything. He placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder once more, a gesture of trust and gratitude. We have a lot of work ahead of us, Marcus, and I'm going to need people I can trust, people with integrity, people who do the right thing even when it's hard, even when it costs them something. Marcus nodded, a new resolve settling over his features, replacing the fear and uncertainty with purpose. He turned and headed for the door with determination in his stride that hadn't been there when he entered. Keanu watched him go, then turned to look out the window at the Los Angeles skyline stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Harrison Vance and Preston Calloway were being driven away from the building they had treated as their personal kingdom, from the power they had assumed was permanent. They had walked in this morning believing they were untouchable, that their positions were secure, that the world was arranged for their benefit. They were leaving with nothing but lawyers and fear and the approaching consequences of their choices. But this was not over, not even close. The executives had been removed, but the damage they had done to the company's culture ran deeper than any single termination could fix. The employees who had learned to judge people by their clothing, who had absorbed the toxic values from the top down, the systems that rewarded arrogance over integrity, the atmosphere of entitlement that had infected every level of the organization. All of it needed to change. All of it needed to be rebuilt from the foundation up. And the 900 people who worked at Meridian Studios, the people who Harrison and Preston had been willing to sacrifice for their own enrichment, who had been pawns in a scheme they knew nothing about, they deserved to know the truth. They deserved to know that their jobs were safe. They deserved to understand what kind of company Meridian was going to become, what values would guide it going forward. Keanu turned away from the window. Vivian, he said, decision made. I need to address the employees, all of them, as soon as possible. The news spread through the building like wildfire through dry grass. Within minutes of Harrison Vance and Preston Calloway being escorted from the building by security, word was everywhere, texts flying, instant messages pinging, whispered conversations in hallways and bathrooms and break rooms. The executives are gone. Harrison and Preston were fired. Security walked them out. The silent investor did it. It's Keanu Reeves. He owns the company. He's been the owner this whole time. No one knew. Outside the building, news vans were already arriving, alerted by sources or social media or the inexplicable ability of media to smell drama. Headlines were being written in real time. Keanu Reeves fires entire executive team after being treated like delivery person at his own company. Hollywood star reveals secret ownership of major studio. Corporate shakeup at Meridian Studios. Meridian Studios stock fluctuated wildly on the market as investors scrambled to understand what was happening, what it meant, whether to buy or sell or hold. Inside the building, the atmosphere was even more turbulent, more uncertain, more frightening. Employees gathered in anxious clusters at every floor, whispering, checking phones, wondering if they should start updating their resumes, wondering if the entire company was about to implode. When executives get fired, layoffs often follow. When ownership makes dramatic moves, restructuring usually comes next. No one knew what came next. The uncertainty was suffocating, paralyzing. Keanu understood this. He understood that the stock market would eventually stabilize, that investors would eventually adjust, that headlines would eventually fade. But the 900 people who worked at Meridian Studios, who depended on their paychecks, who had families and obligations and lives built around their employment here, they could not wait for eventually. They needed answers now. They needed certainty now. They needed to know if their world was ending. "I need to speak to everyone," he told Vivian. "All employees, right now. I'll be in the main atrium in 5 minutes." He took the stairs rather than the elevator, descending through the building he had helped create, passing employees who stared at him with recognition and confusion and hope and fear all mixed together. The main atrium was an impressive architectural space at the heart of Meridian Studios, a soaring open area where all 15 floors connected through balconies and walkways and hanging gardens. Natural light poured in through a massive skylight 3 stories above, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. By the time Keanu reached the ground floor, hundreds of employees had gathered. They lined the balconies on every floor, creating layers of anxious faces looking down. They crowded the ground level, filling every available space. They pressed against railings, craning their necks to see. The murmur of hundreds of simultaneous conversations created a low roar that filled the space. Keanu walked to the center of the atrium floor. He did not climb onto a stage or stand behind a podium. He did not use the raised platform that existed for company presentations. He simply stopped in the middle of the open floor, surrounded by the people he was about to address, standing at their level rather than above them. His worn leather jacket, his faded jeans, his comfortable sneakers. He looked like anyone who might have wandered in off the street, like anyone who worked here, like everyone rather than someone special. The murmuring faded as employees realized he was about to speak. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him. The silence was raw and anxious and desperate for reassurance. Keanu did not use a microphone. His voice carried naturally through the open space, clear and strong. "You've heard the news," he began simply, acknowledging the obvious. "You've seen the headlines forming. You're scared. You're wondering if your job is safe. I understand. I would be scared too." He paused, making eye contact with as many faces as possible, wanting them to see his sincerity, his commitment, his humanity. Harrison Vance, Preston Calloway, and every executive who reported directly to them are no longer employed by this company. They were terminated today. Effective immediately. A ripple of whispers, of gasps, of shock, even though everyone already knew. Hearing it confirmed was different. Keanu waited for the noise to subside. "They were not fired because they failed to recognize me. Let me be very clear about that. They were fired because of how they treated someone they believed was unimportant. Someone they decided wasn't worth basic human courtesy or respect." He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "This morning, I walked into this building wearing the same clothes I wear every day. No suit, no expensive watch, no designer accessories. No signals of wealth or power or importance. Because of how I was dressed, I was told to wait in the hallway like a delivery person. When I entered the boardroom, I was insulted and told to leave. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I didn't look like someone who mattered." Keanu's expression grew thoughtful, vulnerable. "Some of you might wonder why I dress this way. Why someone in my position doesn't wear designer suits and expensive accessories and all the signals of success and power. Let me explain, because it's important that you understand." He paused, gathering his thoughts, deciding how much to share. "I haven't always been successful. There were years when I had nothing. Years when I slept on friends' couches and wondered if I would ever get my next role, my next paycheck, my next chance.
Years when I couldn't afford a decent meal, let alone fancy clothes. Years when I was invisible to the people who mattered in this industry. His voice softened with memory. And then, even after success came, after money wasn't a concern anymore, life reminded me that material things mean nothing when it comes to what actually matters. I've experienced losses that money could never fix. I've buried people I loved. I've sat alone in houses full of expensive things, but completely empty of what makes life worth living. I've learned that designer clothes don't make you a better person, that expensive watches don't make your time more valuable, that wealth doesn't make you worthy of respect. The atrium had gone completely silent. Every person seemed to lean in closer, drawn into the honesty of his words. I choose to dress simply not because I can't afford better. I choose it because I never want to forget what it feels like to have nothing. I never want to become someone who looks at a person in worn clothes and assumes they're worthless. Because I was that person once. And the people who showed me kindness during those years, who gave me chances, who treated me with dignity, they didn't care what I was wearing. They saw me as a human being, and that made all the difference. He let those words settle before continuing, his voice strengthening. What happened to me this morning was not about my wounded pride or my hurt feelings. It was a symptom of a culture that has been allowed to grow inside this company like a poison. A culture where people are judged by the price of their clothing, where respect is given based on job titles and designer labels and external markers of success, where anyone who doesn't look wealthy enough is automatically dismissed, automatically assumed to be unimportant. Keanu swept his gaze across the assembled employees, across the faces watching him from every floor. I built Meridian Studios on different principles. We believed that great ideas could come from anyone, that every person deserved dignity regardless of their position or appearance, that merit mattered more than markers of wealth.
While I was absent, those values were lost, replaced by arrogance and a toxic hierarchy that measured human worth by the brand of watch on your wrist or the label in your jacket. His voice grew warmer, more personal. I want to tell you a story. Many years ago, when I was just starting out in this industry, there was a janitor at a studio where I was filming. His name was George. Every night after everyone left, after the important people went home to their important lives, George stayed behind to clean. Nobody noticed him. Nobody spoke to him. He was invisible, just part of the background. Employees leaned forward, drawn into the narrative. One night, I stayed late to practice my lines, to get a scene right that I was struggling with. George came in to clean. We started talking, just talking like two human beings. He told me he used to be a sound engineer until an accident and medical bills took everything. The janitorial job was how he supported his orphaned granddaughter, how he kept a roof over their heads. Keanu smiled at the memory. That night, George mentioned something about repositioning some equipment to improve the lighting in a scene we'd been struggling with. He said it casually, like it was obvious, like anyone would have noticed. I mentioned his suggestion to the director the next day. He paused for effect. George's suggestion saved the production 3 days of shooting and over $100,000. One simple idea from a man everyone had decided was nobody important. One observation from someone everyone else had trained themselves not to see. He looked out at the crowd with quiet intensity. Great ideas don't come exclusively from expensive boardroom chairs. The most valuable contributions often come from people others overlook. The grip who notices a safety hazard. The assistant who suggests a better schedule. The receptionist who has a brilliant creative insight. The security guard who treats every visitor with respect because he understands a fundamental truth. You never know who might walk through that door. Keanu's voice rose slightly, filled with conviction. Every person in this building deserves to be treated with dignity, not because of what they might do for you, not because they might turn out to be important, not because it's strategically smart, but because they are human beings, and that alone makes them worthy of respect. That alone makes them valuable. That alone means they matter. He paused, his expression hardening. But I haven't told you the worst part. The disrespect I experienced this morning was not the only reason those executives were fired. It wasn't even the main reason. The crowd tensed, the atmosphere shifting from emotional connection to sharp attention. Harrison Vance and Preston Talloway were secretly negotiating to sell off Meridian Studios, not to help it grow, not to secure its future, but to strip it, to take everything valuable and sell it piece by piece. They planned to transfer our most valuable assets to an outside corporation, pocket millions in personal payoffs, and leave the company to collapse, leave it to die. Gasps echoed through the atrium, shocked exclamations, disbelieving whispers. Under their plan, Meridian would have declared bankruptcy within 18 months. More than 900 jobs eliminated, 900 families without income, 900 people thrown into uncertainty and financial crisis, all so two men could get richer. Keanu raised his hand as angry murmurs swelled through the crowd. That plan has been stopped. Your jobs are safe. Meridian Studios is not being sold. It's not being stripped. It's not being destroyed. You have jobs tomorrow. You have jobs next month. You have jobs next year.
You are safe. A wave of relief swept through the crowd like a physical force. Some employees embraced. Others simply closed their eyes, releasing hours of accumulated tension. Some people started crying, overwhelmed by the emotional whiplash of terror followed by relief. But survival is not enough, Keanu continued, his voice strengthening with purpose. I don't just want to save this company. I want to rebuild it on the values it was supposed to represent from the very beginning, the values that should have been maintained. He straightened, speaking with absolute clarity. Starting today, there will be no rigid dress code at Meridian Studios. You will be evaluated on your ideas, your dedication, your integrity, the quality of your work, and the way you treat your colleagues, especially those others might overlook, especially those who might not have power or titles or prestigious positions. Keanu gestured toward Marcus Thorne, standing at the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Marcus Thorne discovered the conspiracy that threatened to destroy this company. He risked his career and his family's security to document what was happening, even when threatened with termination and blacklisting, even when staying silent would have been safer and easier. He paused, letting that sink in. Starting today, Marcus is the acting chief technology officer of Meridian Studios. Applause erupted, genuine and spontaneous and thunderous. People cheering not just for Marcus, but for what he represented, for the message it sent about what would be valued going forward. This is how we will operate now, Keanu said over the applause. Integrity will be rewarded, not punished. Courage will be recognized, not threatened. Doing the right thing will advance your career, not end it. And every person who walks through our doors will be treated with respect. Whether they arrive in a limousine or on a bus, whether they wear a designer suit or a jacket that's seen better days, whether they're a CEO or a janitor or anything in between. He took one more look around the atrium, at the faces watching him from every floor, at the community he was committing to rebuild. I'm not just coming back to save Meridian Studios. I'm coming back to rebuild the culture I should never have let slip away. I'm coming back to make this a place where values matter more than appearances, where character counts for more than clothing, where every human being is treated like a human being. That's my commitment to you. That's my promise. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the atrium exploded with applause. It was not polite corporate clapping. This was raw and real and overwhelming. The sound of hundreds of people releasing fear and replacing it with hope, with possibility, with belief that maybe things really could change. Some cheered, others wiped away tears. The applause went on and on, echoing off the glass and steel and concrete, filling the space with sound and emotion. Keanu did not retreat to an executive floor, or hide in an office, or disappear into a car with tinted windows. He stepped into the crowd, shaking hands, listening to anyone who wanted to speak, making himself available and accessible rather than distant and protected. A young woman from the design department approached him, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly, her voice shaking, "I just wanted to thank you. Last year, I was passed over for a promotion. One of the executives told my manager I didn't present professionally enough. I couldn't afford the clothes they expected, the brands they valued. I've felt invisible here ever since, like I didn't belong, like I wasn't good enough because I couldn't afford to look the part." Keanu listened intently, giving her his full attention. "That changes today," he said firmly. "I promise you that changes today. Your work matters. Your ideas matter. You matter, not your wardrobe." An older man from facilities management stepped forward. "Same thing happened to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've worked here for 17 years. 17 years! But because I wear a maintenance uniform, because I'm not in a suit, some executives wouldn't even look at me in the elevator. Like I wasn't there, like I was part of the furniture, like I didn't exist as a person." A security guard nodded vigorously. "I've seen it every day. People treated completely differently based on what they're wearing. The expensive suits get smiles and handshakes and courtesy. The rest of us get ignored or dismissed. It's like there are two different worlds in this building, and most of us don't matter in the world that counts." Keanu listened to each of them, his expression growing more determined with every story, every testimony, every example of the toxic culture that had taken root. "That ends today," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I promise you, that ends today. And if it doesn't, if you see it continuing, I want you to tell me. I want you to speak up. Because change only happens when people have the courage to say when things are wrong." He continued moving through the crowd, hearing story after story of employees who had been dismissed, overlooked, undervalued, or made to feel worthless because they didn't fit the image of success that Harrison and Preston had cultivated. Each story reinforced his decision, confirmed that the problem ran deeper than he had initially understood. The sun was beginning to set outside the massive windows, painting the Los Angeles skyline in gold and orange and purple. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed completely from morning terror and uncertainty to something like hope, like possibility, like the feeling that maybe things really could be different. But Keanu knew this was only the beginning. The toxic executives had been removed. The employees had been reassured. The immediate crisis had been addressed. But there was still work to do, still systems to change, still a culture to rebuild from the foundation up, still consequences to determine. Harrison and Preston were out there somewhere, probably consulting lawyers, looking for ways to protect themselves, planning their response. And there was still the question of what came next for them. Punishment? Legal action? Something else? Something more meaningful? Keanu excused himself from the crowd with quiet promises to continue these conversations in the coming days and weeks, to maintain this accessibility, to remain present rather than distant. He made his way back toward the conference room, where Vivian waited with updates and decisions that needed to be made. The celebration continued behind him, but his mind was already moving forward, thinking about justice and mercy, about consequences and second chances, about what kind of leader he truly wanted to be, what kind of company he truly wanted to build. 3 days had passed since the terminations, 3 days of media frenzy, endless speculation, stock market adjustments, and internal reorganization. 3 days for the dust to begin settling, and for the full scope of what had happened to become clear, for the evidence to be compiled, for the legal case to be built. Vivian Hartley walked into Keanu's office carrying a thick folder, the kind of folder that represents hundreds of hours of work, that contains the pieces of a puzzle finally assembled into a complete picture.
She placed it on his desk with the quiet precision of someone delivering a verdict, of someone presenting evidence of crimes that could not be ignored or minimized. "We've completed the investigation," she said, her voice carrying the weight of what she was about to reveal. "It's worse than we initially thought, significantly worse." Keanu looked up from the window where he had been watching the city below, thinking about the 900 lives that had almost been destroyed, the company that had almost been gutted, the betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight. Harrison and Preston signed a preliminary agreement with Titan Entertainment Group 4 months ago, Vivian continued, opening the folder to reveal the documented evidence. They violated their fiduciary duties repeatedly and systematically. They deceived shareholders. They deliberately concealed material financial information. They transferred proprietary information to an outside entity without authorization. With the evidence we have, we can pursue civil litigation. They would be personally liable for damages between $15 and $22 million. They would lose everything. She paused, her expression hardening. Additionally, if we forward this file to federal authorities, they could face criminal charges for securities fraud, corporate conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. We're talking potential prison time, 5 to 10 years. Their careers would be permanently destroyed, their reputations irreparably damaged. They would become examples, cautionary tales, warnings to others. Keanu picked up the folder and leafed through the pages slowly. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers, email transcripts revealing secret negotiations, meeting minutes from discussions that should never have happened. The paper trail of betrayal, documented in meticulous, damning detail. He set the folder down and turned back to the window, silent for a long moment. "Vivian," he said finally, his voice thoughtful, "I want to propose a different approach, something that might accomplish more than punishment, something that might actually create change." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "Different how?" "Invite Harrison and Preston to a meeting. No lawyers on their side. Just them, you, and me. I want to speak with them directly, human to human, before we decide on any legal action." Vivian hesitated, her instinct for caution kicking in. "Are you certain? They could refuse. This could be used against us later if things go to court. It could complicate prosecution." "I'm certain," Keanu said quietly. "Set it up." 2 days later, Harrison Vance and Preston Calloway walked into the Meridian Studios conference room for the second time in a week. But everything had changed. Everything. Gone were the expensive suits and the air of entitled confidence and the assumption of power and permanence. Harrison wore a simple blazer that looked like it had been pulled hastily from the back of a closet, wrinkled and ill-fitting. Preston's tie was slightly crooked, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept well in days, that he had spent every waking hour imagining the worst possible outcomes and every sleeping hour dreaming about disaster. They looked like men who had spent days consulting lawyers, who had told them just how much trouble they were in. Like men who had seen the evidence against them and understood that their comfortable lives were over. They looked diminished, reduced, afraid. Keanu sat at the head of the table in the same chair where he had delivered their termination, wearing the same worn leather jacket, the same simple clothes. He did not stand when they entered, did not offer false pleasantries. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Harrison tried to maintain some vestige of stoic dignity, but his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. Preston could not bring himself to make eye contact with anyone, staring instead at the polished wood surface as if hoping it might open up and swallow him.
I'll be direct, Keanu began, his voice calm but carrying undeniable weight. My lawyer has informed you of what we're legally entitled to pursue. Civil litigation for $15 to $22 million in damages. Criminal referral to the FBI for securities fraud and corporate conspiracy. Your careers would be finished permanently and completely. You would likely face years in prison. You would lose everything. Your money, your reputations, your freedom. Everything. Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Preston continued staring at the table, his face pale and drawn. But I don't want to do that, Keanu continued. Both men looked up sharply, startled, confusion and desperate hope flooding their eyes. Was this real? Was there a way out? Not because I forgive you, Keanu continued, his voice hardening. I want to be absolutely clear about that. You betrayed my trust. You conspired to destroy the livelihoods of 900 people. You built a toxic culture that judged human beings by the price of their clothing. You were willing to sacrifice hundreds of families for your own enrichment. I don't forgive any of that. I may never forgive any of that. He let the words sink in, let them sit with their guilt and shame. But I've learned something over the years, through loss and hardship and watching people I loved suffer. Punishment isn't always the best answer. Destroying someone isn't always justice. Sometimes, creating an opportunity for people to make things right, to genuinely change, to contribute something positive to the world, sometimes that does more good than making them suffer. Keanu placed a document on the table and slid it toward them. This is a settlement agreement. If you sign it, we won't pursue civil litigation. We won't forward anything to federal authorities. You won't face criminal charges or financial ruin or prison. In exchange, you agree to 4 conditions, non-negotiable. Take it or leave it. Harrison stared at the document like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. First, Keanu said, holding up one finger, you will issue a public apology. Not to me, I don't need your apology. To the employees of Meridian Studios, the people whose lives you were willing to destroy for your own enrichment, the people who trusted that their leadership actually cared about them. He held up a second finger. Second, you will donate $4 million to the Los Angeles Food Bank and homeless services organizations throughout the city. This money will come from the bonuses you've received over the past several years. It will feed tens of thousands of people who are struggling, people whose society often overlooks and dismisses, people like the ones you looked right through when you decided they weren't worth your attention. Harrison's face had gone pale. Preston looked like he might be sick. That was a substantial portion of their savings, of their accumulated wealth. Third, Keanu continued, holding up a third finger, you will each complete 300 hours of volunteer service at homeless shelters and food kitchens throughout Los Angeles. Not for publicity, not for photo opportunities, not for reputation management. You will serve meals, clean tables, wash dishes, and look into the eyes of people you would have walked past without a second glance. People you would have dismissed as unimportant based on their appearance. He paused, his eyes moving between them. You will do this because you need to understand something that your expensive educations and corner offices and years of privilege never taught you. Every human being has value. Every person deserves dignity. It doesn't matter what they're wearing. It doesn't matter what they can do for you. It doesn't matter if they'll ever be successful by conventional measures. They matter because they are human beings. That's the lesson you failed to learn. This is your chance to learn it. He held up a fourth finger. Fourth and finally, you will participate in mandatory ethics training and workshops on leadership, privilege, and unconscious bias. You will learn about the impacts of economic inequality, about how judging people by appearance creates systemic injustice. You will learn to see what you've trained yourselves not to see. And you will complete this training with verified attendance and participation. The room fell into heavy silence. Harrison finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if we refuse?" Vivian answered before Keanu could, her voice hard and final. "Then we proceed with full legal action. And I promise you, with the evidence we have, you will lose everything. You will lose far more than $4 million. You will lose your freedom. You will lose any chance at redemption. You will become examples of corporate greed and betrayal. Your names will be synonymous with everything wrong with American business culture. That will be your legacy." Preston looked at Harrison. Harrison looked at the document. For a long moment, neither moved, both calculating, both weighing their options, both realizing they had no real choice. Then Harrison picked up the pen with a shaking hand and signed his name. Preston signed immediately after, his signature barely legible. "You can go," Keanu said quietly. The two men rose slowly, moving toward the door like sleepwalkers, like men who had been given a second chance they hadn't earned and knew they didn't deserve. Harrison paused at the threshold, turning back as if he wanted to say something, wanted to express gratitude or acknowledge what Keanu had done, but no words came. He simply nodded once, a gesture that might have been gratitude or shame, or both, and then they were gone. When the door closed, Vivian turned to Keanu. "Are you sure about this? They deserved worse, much worse. Most people would say you were too lenient, that you let them off easy, that they should pay the full price for what they tried to do." Keanu smiled slightly, that gentle expression that those who knew him recognized as rare and genuine. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but $4 million will feed tens of thousands of hungry people for months. 300 hours at a food kitchen might actually change how they see the world, how they see people, how they see themselves. A public apology will remind everyone that arrogance always comes with a price, and the ethics training might, just might, help them become better people." He looked out the window at the city stretching toward the horizon, at the millions of lives being lived out there, at the complexity and pain and beauty of human existence. Punishment would only hurt them. What we're doing might actually help them change. And more importantly, it will definitely help the people who need it most. The hungry people who will be fed, the homeless people who will be served with dignity, the employees here who will see that consequences can be restorative rather than purely punitive. That's worth more than revenge. In the weeks and months that followed, Keanu did not disappear back into the shadows as he had done 7 years before. He stayed.
Not as a distant investor monitoring quarterly reports and reviewing sanitized summaries, but as an active leader walking the halls of the company he had built, engaging with employees at every level, rebuilding the culture one interaction at a time. He established the Open Door program, an initiative designed specifically to give opportunities to people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or written off by traditional hiring practices. Former inmates who had served their time and were working to rebuild their lives, who deserved a second chance. Homeless individuals who were fighting their way back to stability, who needed someone to believe in them. Young people from underserved neighborhoods who had never had access to the entertainment industry, who had talent and ideas but no connections or opportunities. They were trained, mentored, given real responsibilities, and evaluated based on their abilities and dedication rather than their backgrounds or appearances. Merit became the only measure that truly mattered. He changed the hiring process entirely throughout the organization. No photographs required on applications, removing the ability to judge candidates by appearance. First-round interviews conducted blind, where recruiters could only hear candidates' voices and evaluate their ideas without seeing their faces or their clothes or making assumptions based on visual cues. Second-round interviews focused entirely on work samples and problem-solving rather than polish and presentation. The goal was to identify talent and character, not performance and appearance. Once a month, Keanu spent an entire day working alongside different departments,
Not as the owner or as a celebrity, but as a colleague learning and contributing. One month he sat with the security team, learning their routines, hearing their concerns, understanding the challenges they faced. Another month he helped the facilities crew reorganize storage rooms and repair equipment. Another month he worked in the mailroom, sorting and delivering packages, talking to people at every level of the organization. He ate lunch regularly in the cafeteria with entry-level employees, administrative assistants, production coordinators, people who rarely got face time with leadership. He asked questions and genuinely listened to the answers. He wanted to understand Meridian Studios from the ground up, not from the sanitized perspective of executive summaries and carefully curated information. Marcus Thorne was officially promoted to Chief Technology Officer, the word acting finally and permanently removed from his title. He became more than just a promoted employee. He became a symbol of what Meridian Studios now valued: integrity and courage, recognized and rewarded regardless of previous position or political maneuvering. His story spread through the company, becoming part of the culture, a reminder that doing the right thing mattered more than playing politics. 6 months after the events of that extraordinary day, Meridian Studios announced its newest project. It was a documentary film about social inequality, unconscious bias, and the prejudices people face based on appearance. The film would explore how society makes snap judgments about worth and value based on clothing, addresses, and other superficial markers that have nothing to do with actual character or ability. It would tell the stories of people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated simply because they didn't fit narrow images of success. It would challenge viewers to examine their own biases and assumptions. Keanu was not just the executive producer providing funding and approval. He had agreed to appear in the film in a small but significant role, playing a homeless man that people walk past without seeing, without acknowledging, without recognizing as fully human. The premiere was held at a historic Los Angeles theater, a beautifully restored building that had shown films for nearly a century. The guest list was unlike any Hollywood event anyone could remember. Alongside industry executives in designer suits and dresses sat volunteers from the Open Door program, shelter workers in their everyday clothes, and formerly homeless individuals who had found their way to stability through programs funded by donations like Harrison and Preston's mandated contribution. They sat side by side, equals in the audience, distinguished only by their shared humanity rather than by wealth or status or appearance. After the screening, during the press reception in the theater's elegant lobby, a journalist from a major entertainment publication approached Keanu with a question that had been circulating since the story first broke 6 months earlier, a question that represented what many people were thinking. "Mr. Reeves," the journalist asked, microphone extended, "do you have any regrets about firing your entire executive team? Some people say you overreacted, that you destroyed careers just because they made you wait a few minutes in a lobby. What do you say to critics who think the punishment didn't fit the crime?" Keanu considered the question carefully, thoughtfully, before responding. He had been asked variations of this question dozens of times, and his answer remained consistent because it was true. "I didn't fire them because they failed to recognize me," he said clearly. "I fired them because of how they treated someone they thought didn't matter, someone they assumed had nothing to offer them, someone they decided wasn't worth basic human courtesy based solely on appearance. That's not about me, that's about fundamental values." He paused, choosing his next words with care. That's the true measure of a person's character, not how they treat people with power or wealth or status, not how they behave when they think someone important is watching, but how they treat the people they believe are beneath them, the ones they think they'll never need, the ones they assume don't count, the ones they've trained themselves not to see. That reveals who you really are when all the performance and pretense are stripped away. Keanu looked out at the crowd, where guests in expensive designer outfits mingled easily with people in simple, modest clothing, all sharing the same space, the same conversation, the same moment, the same humanity. Real power isn't about titles or wealth or appearances or the ability to make others feel small. Real power is using whatever position you have to lift others up, to create opportunity, to extend dignity, especially to the people that society tends to forget or dismiss or walk past without seeing. In a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the cameras and the circulating waiters with champagne, a man stood alone, watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read, complex and layered with emotion. Harrison Vance had completed his 300 hours of volunteer service 2 weeks earlier. He had served thousands of meals to people experiencing homelessness. He had cleaned countless tables. He had washed dishes until his hands were raw. He had looked into the eyes of people he once would have dismissed without a thought, people he had trained himself to not see. And something inside him had shifted in ways he was still trying to understand, still trying to process. He had not come to the premiere seeking attention or redemption or praise. The journalist from a major entertainment publication approached Keanu with a question that had been circulating since the story first broke 6 months earlier, a question that represented what many people were thinking. "Mr. Reeves," the journalist asked, microphone extended, "do you have any regrets about firing your entire executive team? Some people say you overreacted, that you destroyed careers just because they made you wait a few minutes in a lobby. What do you say to critics who think the punishment didn't fit the crime?" Keanu considered the question carefully, thoughtfully, before responding. He had been asked variations of this question dozens of times, and his answer remained consistent because it was true. "I didn't fire them because they failed to recognize me," he said clearly. "I fired them because of how they treated someone they thought didn't matter. Someone they assumed had nothing to offer them. Someone they decided wasn't worth basic human courtesy based solely on appearance. That's not about me, that's about fundamental values." He paused, choosing his next words with care. That's the true measure of a person's character. Not how they treat people with power or wealth or status. Not how they behave when they think someone important is watching. But how they treat the people they believe are beneath them. The ones they think they'll never need. The ones they assume don't count. The ones they've trained themselves not to see. That reveals who you really are when all the performance and pretense are stripped away. Keanu looked out at the crowd, where guests in expensive designer outfits mingled easily with people in simple, modest clothing, all sharing the same space, the same conversation, the same moment, the same humanity. Real power isn't about titles or wealth or appearances or the ability to make others feel small. Real power is using whatever position you have to lift others up, to create opportunity, to extend dignity, especially to the people that society tends to forget or dismiss or walk past without seeing. In a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the cameras and the circulating waiters with champagne, a man stood alone, watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read, complex and layered with emotion. Harrison Vance had completed his 300 hours of volunteer service 2 weeks earlier. He had served thousands of meals to people experiencing homelessness. He had cleaned countless tables. He had washed dishes until his hands were raw. He had looked into the eyes of people he once would have dismissed without a thought, people he had trained himself to not see. And something inside him had shifted in ways he was still trying to understand, still trying to process. He had not come to the premiere seeking attention or redemption or praise. He had not publicized his attendance or sought recognition for his changed perspective. He had come because he needed to see what Keanu had built, what Meridian Studios had become, what he himself had almost destroyed. What kind of company it could be when values actually mattered more than appearances, when character counted more than clothing, when human dignity was extended universally rather than conditionally. When Keanu finished speaking to the journalist, when the conversation moved on to other topics, Harrison joined the applause rippling through the crowd. It was soft, almost tentative, the applause of a man who understood that he was witnessing something meaningful, something important, something he had nearly prevented from ever existing. No one recognized him, no one approached him, no one knew his story or his connection to this moment. And perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Perhaps anonymity was its own form of grace. And so this is how Keanu Reeves reclaimed his company and rebuilt its soul. Not through blind rage or vindictive punishment or the exercise of power for its own sake, but through principle and dignity and a deep understanding that how you treat people matters more than any quarterly report or stock price or external measure of success.
He transformed a moment of profound disrespect into an opportunity to redefine what corporate culture could be, to demonstrate that businesses could value character over appearance, that organizations could measure success by how they treated the least powerful among them. He proved that leadership is not about commanding from above, or demanding deference, or creating hierarchies of worth, but about standing alongside the people you serve, about extending dignity universally, about recognizing that every human being has inherent value, regardless of what they wear, or what they can offer you, or how they might benefit your career. This story reminds us of a simple but profound truth that's easy to forget in a world obsessed with wealth and status and superficial markers of success. You can judge a company, an organization, a person, a culture, not by how they treat the powerful and successful and well-connected, but by how they treat those they believe to be unimportant. The receptionist, the security guard, the janitor, the person in the worn jacket waiting in the hallway, the homeless person on the street. These interactions reveal character in ways that boardroom presentations and carefully crafted public statements never can. Because true respect never comes with conditions. It is not reserved for those who can offer something in return, who can advance your career, who can benefit you in some way. It is extended freely to everyone as a recognition of their fundamental humanity, their inherent worth as human beings. And arrogance, no matter how well dressed, no matter how expensively adorned, no matter how confidently performed, always eventually pays its price. Sometimes that price comes in the form of a quiet man in a worn leather jacket who turns out to own everything you thought was yours. What do you think of Keanu's approach? Was the settlement the right choice, or did Harrison and Preston deserve harsher consequences? How do we balance justice with the possibility of redemption? These are not simple questions with easy answers. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about how we treat the people around us, if it challenged you to examine your own biases and assumptions, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places, from the most unlikely teachers.
And sometimes the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the one who changes everything. Sometimes the quiet observer in the corner sees more than all the loud voices in the center. Sometimes the person everyone dismissed is exactly the person everyone needed.